Welcome, everyone. This is the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments Research Forum monthly call for February. Thanks for joining us today. I will hand it over to Claire Richards, one of our Research Forum co-chairs.
Hey everyone, we're happy to see you here today. Go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. My name is Dr. Claire Richards. I'm an assistant professor of nursing at Washington State University. Dr. LeClaire is here as well. I could let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jessica LeClaire, and I'm a postdoctoral trainee with the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Nursing.
And we are excited to share Dr. Shawna Beese with all of you today. Shawna was a PhD student at WSU and has moved on to Extension. And I will let her introduce herself.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Richards and Dr. LeClaire, for inviting me to share a little bit about my program and just the extension, because it's an atypical environment, I think, for nurses to be practicing in, but I hope to share a little bit about what that environment's like. So today I'll be sharing a little bit about my building multi-level resilience as an extension scientist. I'm the assistant professor of rural health promotion through Connors and the WSU Extension. Okay. So the objective today is I'm going to identify the three components of a cooperative extension system by way of introducing what all that means. I'll introduce an emerging concept and just touch briefly on this emerging entity called the health extension. And then I'll spend the last half of the presentation just describing my rural health promotion research and operationally identifying my big aha of the last 3 years. I'm in my third year of faculty as multi-level resilience. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, when in a little bit of a history lesson. In 1862, they did a Morrill Act in acknowledgement that there was just huge land mass without universities. The universities were primarily located over on the east side of the country, and saying that we needed to really emphasize agricultural practices and create centers that there would be innovation around agricultural sciences, the industrial arts and sciences, and also engineering throughout the country. And so the federal government granted land to different university systems, the thinking being there should be a university in each state that is able to foster an innovative climate around those three things, being agricultural, engineering, and industrial arts and consumer sciences. And so WSU happened to be the one that was provided for in Washington State, but we were not even though we are provided our land through the 1862 Morrill Act. We actually didn't get up and running until 1890. Also in 1890, the Morrill Act was revisited in acknowledgement of the segregated South and saying there are huge African-American populations that are being underserved or not being served at all by their universities. And so there was additional land grant universities that were provided for that started up the historical Black colleges and universities. There was also additional resources to the existing land grant university, with the understanding that they were not to be, that there should be desegregation to accessing those services. And then in 1994 was our last iteration of the cooperative extension system. And that is when Native American and tribal colleges were acknowledged as being part of this and being underserved. And honestly, some of the land that had been granted to some of the land grant universities had original owners. And so now they have been brought into the fold, and tribal colleges and Native American universities are thriving within the cooperative system. They have their own separative cooperative extension system, but you will find at the state level, there's a lot of collaboration for all people who are doing this kind of work. And so the magic of network, you know, even with some problematic past. But the magic is that we were able to realize our potential, and we became a very potent dissemination vehicle in all of bringing world-class innovation, world-class knowledge, and bringing it, translating it into communities of practices throughout local, being driven by the local needs. And so, so it was really considered quite a success. There are 3 parts of the cooperative extension. Oh, I see I've got myself a little imaging effects that I didn't know I had put in there. But anyways, the 3 parts of the cooperative extension are, you have your campus-based faculty. These are traditional faculty, and Connors are College of Agricultural, Human, and Natural Resource Sciences for our university. So I'm going to use our university as a template, but please know that more land-grant universities are more similar than they are not similar. So there might be some variation from state to state, but we do filter up to the federal level. So there's a lot of homogeneity too. And so we have regular academic appointments. In our university, it's 36 appointments, and they teach ag. We have added in human development, and we'll get a little bit into that later, and the natural resource sciences, so like land management. And these faculty tend to be people who teach, do university service, and then have their research appointment either partial or fully attached to the extension. So there should be doing research that furthers the extension mission. We also have research and extension centers, 4 of them in our state, and each has a specialty. So like in Wenatchee, we have the tree fruit specialty. Puyallup, they have urban agriculture specialty. Mount Vernon, which is only 1 county down from me, has just what was called the Northwest. We are the high commodities agricultural base, so we do 85% of the berries for all of the United States from our basin. So those tend to be small fruit, but driven by the economic sector of that area. You'll notice they're all ag focused because that is our underpinnings, but I think you'll see that we are evolving as a system. And then there's the county-based extension system, and that is by and large the biggest portion. So there's an office in every single county that is made up of program APs, which is administrative professionals that are doing a lot of the legacy program or pre-existing programming, things that you can think of like 4-H, programs like Master Gardeners, programs like Strengthening Families, ones that are already evidence-based, well-established, and just need to be disseminated. And then you also have county-based faculty like myself that usually have a specific function that was identified as a state-level need. And the thought being that we're developing and innovating new programming similar to our academic counterparts, at campus-based counterparts that start in our county. So they carefully select, like the rural health promotion persons should be somewhere in that corridor, Northwest corridor, where all the agricultural activities going on. And a successful program would be one that you validate by evidence and then disseminate through the entire state beyond your county walls, with the hope, the big hope is that you have an evidence-based program at some point that is ready for national dissemination, and then it becomes a legacy program. So hopefully someday you'll be hearing about Grassroots Neighboring, the program that I'm developing, in the same vein that you hear about 4-H or Master Gardeners. The 3 program areas for our university are, as expected, ag, natural resources. We also have community economic development, and they tie in the engineering component and that industrial arts and science. But we do have a human development department at WSU, and so we are emerging not just 4-H, which is positive youth development, but really thinking about how do youth, families, and eventually someday I imagine this department being called Youth, Families, and Communities. How do we look at to deliver health promotion, so true health promotion out in the community? And that's the unit I come from. One of my academic or campus-based colleagues, Dr. Elizabeth Waybright, she is a co-editor and co-author of this book that is just touching on a new emerging thought. So around the turn of the century, people started to wonder, we are a powerful dissemination network, and we are very good at translating and accelerating translation of good science into actual practice, and then also community adapting it and feeding that back up to the people who are developers from community-based feedback. So we've been doing community engaged research way before it was a thing that everybody did or strived for. And around the turn of the century, people started to wonder, what if, in acknowledging that food science has really emerged into being able to mitigate some obesity trends that they were seeing nationwide, healthy food was emerging as food as medicine. We were already looking at programming or delivering programming early 21st century on diabetes management. What if some of those fingerprints that were starting out in the food science could actually be brought forward and just with the extension in the 21st century around health, that we used the extension in the 20th century to advance agricultural science. And so this emerging thought of, what about delivering to under-resourced areas health extension, community-based practices? And that really dovetails nicely into my dissertation, which talked about the epidemiological transition that's been happening for the last 100 years. What used to kill us is not what kills us anymore. It is not communicable diseases. Even when we were amidst the pandemic, it was not communicable diseases. It's no longer trauma. What is killing us or driving mortality in the United States is, in fact, chronic disease development. And what we are starting to believe as a scientific community is stress-mediated chronic disease development. So waiting for a florid presentation of illness to be present before you start setting the stage for health would be a failed venture, because episodic care, you already have deep disease taking root. Where we're looking out in the community, what are socio-environmental factors that we can be doing, augmenting or empowering neighborhoods to change for themselves, that will actually increase overall health and well-being, and perhaps even over decades, be able to bring down some of that rural mortality that we see. So that is about the cooperative healthcare system, or the cooperative extension system. Now I'm going to pivot and talk a little bit about my research program specifically. So like I said, that was my dissertation focus, and I was so excited when they posted a rural health promotion faculty position as I was graduating that talked about a lot about that rural urban mortality gap. And so when I decided to apply and I decided I was and I was invited in for a job talk, I started doing a lot of research about the extension system, because as Claire pointed out, I graduated from nursing school. So I was very population health focused, a lot of observational studies, a lot of statistics, not a lot of community consideration for that day. I was always thinking community would be something in the future. And one of the things that I found is, even in its earliest years, an essential part of the land-grant tradition has been to promote neighborhood resilience. Now, back in the day, they were doing it more for agricultural practices and specifically community economic development, developing those economic sectors. But I think that you lean on your strengths, and we already had some mechanisms for being able to be out there in neighborhoods and building that resilience. And that was important because the problem they were trying to solve with my position, the rural health promotion position, and I wasn't aware of, because my dissertation was a suburban focused dissertation, but I was not aware that so our mortality, our highest level, our highest age of what we were expected to live actually peaked in 2014. And that's true for all United States, in all geographic regions, geographic context, is that in 2014, our life expectancy was the highest it has been, and has actually been receding since then. Well, in 2014, there was already a rural urban mortality gap, which was concerning, but it continued to grow as we receded. So rural, as their life expectancy declined at a more rapid rate than the urban and suburban counterparts, although those are decreasing as well. And by 2019, rural mortality was approximately 20% higher than urban mortality. And so that was the problem they were trying to solve. Hey, we've got a growing, widening urban mortality gap. We need someone to get out there and help us figure out, what's going on and how could the extension be helpful in that. Turns out rurality as a geographic context is a determinant of health. It is associated with effects that are on par with educational attainment. How many studies do we do where we're tying it back to educational attainment, and actually surpasses the effects of race? So even though I was unfamiliar with some of these things I was discovering during my job talk, I also saw some through lines around what my dissertation was about, using that neighborhood to address the overall mortality changes and seeing how we could hopefully mitigate or promote health right there in the community setting before we even get that florid presentation. So I pitched a talk and I boldly declared during my job talk that if I was hired, I would develop an evidence-based program that addressed stress-mediated chronic disease through neighborhood approaches, and that my hope was in 10 years, this would be something that we had, tested for feasibility, accessibility by the community standards. We had already tested efficacy, and it was evidence-based. It was ready to launch beyond our state's walls. And I got hired. So I had quite a challenge on my hands. So I did a lot of the same things all of us do when we're first postdoctoral and in our first faculty position. Now, because I was community-based and I had this new mandate that I was supposed to try and achieve in 10 years, I was busy doing community needs assessments in tandem with some of this work. I was doing community needs assessments first in my own county to make sure that anything that I was offering or anything that could potentially turn into my future intervention was actually anchored or grounded in something that was actually important for rural residents and not just something I read in some of my literature. And then as I learned more about the rural disparities and just how you measure rurality, I mean, there's 71 ways to measure rurality. And so I became like a measurement expert on how do we measure rurality? What are the different types of rurality? Because the USDA actually identifies 5 different rurality types, and my county only represented one of them, agriculture. And so I started to broker some relationships with other directors of key counties that represented the other parts, being manufacturing, bedroom communities, recreational communities, and then also mining / forestry rural environments where they're doing a lot of land extraction. And so I brokered relationships with Skagit County, which is a big agricultural, but it is also a huge forestry county. Mason County or Grace Harbor, Mason County, Stevens County, and Okinawan. And that became my tight 6 because all of us together represented the full scope of what it means to be rural, at least through the economic sector lens. And that gave me a good foundation for my interviewing, for my eventual sampling. We're doing a confirmatory factor analysis on a rural neighborhood development tool that me and my research partner, Dr. DeYoung, put together. It gave a more holistic view than if I just kept going back to my own agricultural community. Now, I'm willing to sample or interview anyone in Washington State that is over 18 volunteers and is identifying themselves as living rural. But it gave me a good foundation where I could really get to know the realities of those counties and form actual earnest relationships with the people, because that is so important when you're asking people to do community gauge research. You have to have an earnest relationship, or you have to be alongside somebody who actually has that earnest relationship as you develop your own with that community. But I also did the things we all did post, our first faculty position. That first year or 2 was just spent putting out those manuscripts for my dissertation, doing all the follow-up studies I promised I would do it during my defense. And one of those was during my dissertation, I had done a suburban looking at grounded theory with suburban neighborhood, looking at how do they build healthy neighborhoods and that just promote overall well-being. And we did discover there is we emerged that there was a good process for this, a socially driven process, in that you increase trust, but all within the context of perceived neighborhood safety. If you have perceived neighborhood safety, but you have not increased trust, and we see this manifested in a lot of, especially first gen immigrants, they live in the same neighborhood as the people who are benefiting from that neighborhood. But if they don't perceive their safety there, then, and that's not always attached to just crime rates, it is highly associated with perceived crime, but it's also a lot of other factors, you are unable to increase that trust. And so we discovered that was that socially driven process. But now I was in a rural area, and I wanted to know, number one, does this model even transfer? Because I was hearing a lot of people questioning whether there are even such a thing as a neighborhood in rural areas. I mean, when you have like between 5 miles between you and your neighbor, is that really a neighborhood anymore? And so in 2023, I spent my entire year interviewing people who were over 18, lived rural, and were willing to be interviewed by me around just that. Is this a transferable model? Do you conceive that there is a neighborhood, that you exist within a neighborhood? And if so, what is what are the neighborhood characteristics? What does neighborhood look like to you as a construct? And then 3, we were also looking at our base scale, because we had looked at the neighborhood trust and safety model using social cohesion scale, using Ross-Morawski's neighborhood social disorder, and then also 2 items from the International Physical Activity Prevalence Study, and which was highly valid and highly reliable metrics, but we wanted to rurally adapt that. So we were also asking questions about rural adaptation. Do you perceive safety the same way as someone in urban? So like, for instance, on the Ross-Morawski's, one of the questions is something about vandalism. Well, that's an indicator for crime if you're in an urban setting, but that's not necessarily an indicator of crime if you're in a rural setting. In fact, a lot of things I heard about what you would find as an early indicator that maybe the neighborhood's in decline or that we don't feel safe is that I locked my front door, or I don't leave my keys in my car anymore. And so there was a different flavor. Also, the relationship between police. When we think of crime in a urban and suburban setting, largely that's tied into our thinking around policing. That's not a thing out in rural. So there, in a lot of ways, rural neighborhoods are very progressive in their actual building into the system things that would mitigate crime before it even starts, or prevent crime from even happening in the first place, because there isn't a service of policing that is available to them. And so we fed that into our rural neighborhood development scale. And then last, one of the central hypotheses that came out of my dissertation is, okay, if increasing neighborhood safety and increasing neighborhood trust is the mechanism, I was tying it in my dissertation study to just overall well-being. But now I have this new thing, is it stress mediated? And so I was wondering, is that actually associated with decreased stress? We couldn't measure allostatic load, but we did have Cohen's perceived stress scale available to us. And in fact, all those items are associated significantly with decreases of perceived stress on behalf of the individual participants. So that formed the foundation of a lot of the thinking as I transitioned into that second and third year and actually started to get out there and think and start developing what would that program look like. I have to tell you, both in my PhD and then also in my first couple years, I was doing a lot of DAGs. So the directed acyclic graphing of everything, if neighborhood disadvantage does this predict this? So you could test these little hypotheses. And one of the things I found out in all my DAGging, and then also in all the literature reviews that I was doing, so I actually received from the Thomas Foley Policy Institute funding to do 3 separate scoping reviews or literature reviews that would form the foundation of my understanding. And so as I was doing those literature reviews, I noticed in the literature, more often than not, it wasn't a one-directional, relationship. There was a lot of bi-directional and kind of started to feel like a loop. So for instance, if you have neighborhood disadvantage, that is associated with people experiencing higher stress burdens and having lower adaptive capacity for stress functioning over life course. a group of people who have maladaptive stress responses, and have higher levels of chronic disease also can lead to increased or further decline of neighborhood or further increases in neighborhood disadvantage. And so I started to see that a lot of the linear relationships that me and Dr. DeYoung had been measuring for the first 2, 3 years of my faculty, we're probably starting to feel like a multi-level loop where you have an individual level, a familial/household level, and then a neighborhood level. And I'm sure there's more, but these were the ones that I was the most familiar with. And that each level had a positive association with the other one. So, if you increase your adaptive capacity, your healthier stress response person, that actually was correlated with having a healthier household and more collective efficacy, which ultimately I found out was what the big construct that is trust and safety. And that comes from Dr. Robert Sampson's, collective efficacy and can we work together. Why those things, trust and safety, are important is, and why belonging would ultimately be essential is because without those things, we can't work effectively together. And working effectively is the adaptive capacity function of the neighborhood level. And so I became pretty convinced that what we were dealing with was a dynamic system that was a reinforcing system, and that the function at each level was in fact adaptive capacity. So on the individual level, it was that stress adaptive capacity. I'm not experiencing my fight or flight as a chronic condition. Therefore, I have more effective stress management practices. I'm not lending myself to higher levels of early chronic disease development, increased mortality, earlier mortality. At the familial level, material resources, specifically flexible resources. So not necessarily like, do you have money for food? It's, do you have the mechanism to pivot within? If you need food, that's what money is a flexible resource because you can spend it on food. You can also spend it on something else if another need arises. So it's not just material resources in that, like, oh, if someone gave me a box of food, then I'd be covered. It's actually that ability to have that flexible resource to adapt to the needs of the household in that month. And connection, family belonging, and then positive framing. And then at the neighborhood level, we became very convinced that collective efficacy, or ability to execute, to function well together, act on each other's behalf, and all that was the function. And so this became the model, the conceptual model that now me and my research associate, collaborators function from. I also inherited a new, in addition to Dr. DeYoung, who's amazing, but we, again, have a lot of linear statistical practices. I now work also with Dr. Yuan Wong, who does some machine learning and has some more familiarity with these dynamic systems. And we're working on this. The good news about this as a conceptual model is part of the reason why you DAG is so that you're developing your overall theory of change and you know where to start. If this is the conceptual model, then you start where you're invited, at the level you're invited in. If a group's reaching out to me because they want better stress management skills, guess what? That goes to the overall goal that I'm trying to achieve here. If they invite me in to deal with lack of collective efficacy, and I will let you know post-COVID, that is actually how most communities do want to engage me, is that, hey, we've got a lot of ideas, we got a lot of plans, we have identified a lot of needs, but we don't know how to function together. We've lost some of that collective implementation muscle as a community over not just COVID, over probably decades. That's harkens back to Dr. Robert Putnam's work around civic engagement. And just it's a muscle. If you don't use it, and you don't know how to work well together as a group, and you've become extremely individualistic, it's not just going to be there. It's like riding a bike. Once you do realize, oh my gosh, we need each other, and there's all these cool things we can do. And so now I primarily work through the Prevention Coalition infrastructure of Washington State, specifically engaging communities for 2-year engagements around how to identify, plan, and execute on superordinate goals. And superordinate goals are goals that cannot be achieved as a singular person. It has to require community engagement. I also get to do a lot of fun things that get to be part of this too. Like one group is engaging me for January through the end of the school year around fifth graders, because the fifth graders were the highest grade of this group. And so they came up with a leadership group knowing that I was doing superordinate goal work on large with bigger communities, and asked me to come out and just work with their fifth graders for the remainder of the school year, achieving two little baby superordinate goals. We're putting a chicken coop in a community garden, and we're also building a little box garden set off of the driveway or parking lot of the building and such. And so that has been fun, because I get to teach them that, number one, leadership is an action, not a position. That if you see a need and you are willing to rally group work around that need, you are already a leader, and you can trust that you are, especially if you're open to learning those skills on the spot, that you will get those skills, the project management, all those other skills. There will be somebody there to teach you those other things. So the big thing is being able to see the need, being willing to rally group activity around that. And of course, that's its whole skill set on its own. You got to listen and understand that being a leader doesn't mean you get to be in charge. It just means that you're the one that's accountable for moving things forward. And so that's been a really rewarding group. And then the last thing that a last little project I'll end on before we go into discussion is I have been paired up with Dr. Jessica Kastner, who is a dear mentor to me. Actually introduced me to David Burton from University of Missouri. And he is one of the only other people in the country that looks at neighboring as a potential intervention for how you heal communities. And he has got an award-winning program. It's in its fifth year of award-winning, called Neighboring 101. He also has done a lot of work around getting people to take this neighborhood pledge, or good neighbor pledge. So it's not about neighborhoods, because I was all thinking about neighborhoods, what characteristics make a good neighborhood, where he's like, no, it's about neighboring. It's about what we do. And so we're gearing up to launch some of what he's been doing here in Washington State. So specifically, I'm going to be doing a big push around the Good Neighboring Pledge. And that's just a 5-minute survey that you take. And through taking the Good Neighboring Pledge, he's basically educating you on some foundational good neighboring practices, and also soliciting that buy-in. Will you be willing to do this in the next month to further your neighborhood? And he's gonna, we have a data agreement, so he's gonna collect data for me to help me illustrate impact for Washington State. And then also I'm working specifically with, we're hoping to get as many municipalities and as many counties to declare a proclamation of Good Neighborhood Week this fall. And our hope is that we can keep building on that to potentially even usher in the same level of state legislative wins that he's had around getting the entire state legislature to agree with having a Good Neighboring Week, and how can we use this to promote great prevention strategies all under the umbrella of good neighboring. And so very excited about this partnership that I have with him. So that's kind of a day in the life of an extension scientist. I will let you know that I did mention that I had a job talk in July of 2022. And I got the job. But one of the comments that was given to me is that they had never seen a new graduate so prepared, with a clear vision of what they were going to and specifically like underlying mechanisms and processes of how they would achieve that. And I 100% chalk that up to the fact I had participated in the Environmental Health Research Institute for Nurse and Clinician Scientists this year before. Me and Claire were in the same class together, and we really did some deep work about thinking about what kind of impact do you want to do in your community? How do you want to translate specific practices into community or specific knowledges into community-based practices. And so I had a lot of sorting through for that year. And so I want to offer that opportunity to everyone. They're still doing enrollment. I think it's only for a couple days. And I do see that most of the participants have actually been through that program. So maybe during the discussion, we can open it up to any impacts that you have felt from that, but I definitely could not say enough good about this opportunity. And so if you're even getting a little tug, should I apply, I would encourage you to apply. All right, well, thank you so much for your time today.